I would like to take this opportunity to introduce an old friend to this area. Ed Williams has been the director of the Ellicott City B&O Museum, and he was very instrumental in working with the restoration work for the B&O Museum downtown. When the roof collapsed and all the millions of dollars of damage were done, he was a key person to bring it back. And he's been instrumental in interpretive work and historic work throughout the area. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ed, and we'll have him start talking as we work out the bugs in this thing.
Good. Thanks, John. I've been asked to speak several times in reference to the B&O or its history in relationship to the River Valley, or in this case to the Thomas Viaduct, because of the celebration. And whenever I'm asked to talk, I'm very flattered. In this case, more flattered than normal, because this is an encore request of a talk that I did in Relay at the annual meeting. So it's double flattery to be here. The talk, by the way, is never the same twice. The history that occurred between 1827 and 1868, which is really my forte in B&O history, is staggering. And you can't put in 15 or 20 minutes what occurred in that time frame, from either an academic standpoint, a philosophical standpoint, or an economic standpoint. The change that occurred in the country because of the inception of the railroad is staggering. And you could put together, pardon me, a college course that would probably last 2 full semesters just to discuss how and why railroading began in the United States and its impact. To understand how it relates to the Thomas Viaduct, I think it's important to have a grasp of how and why railroading began, kind of as a foundation to where I'm going to go with the story about one of my favorite train fans, Benjamin Butler. Because Harry Eck is smiling. Benjamin Butler was a general in the United States Army from Boston, Massachusetts, who ended up coming to Maryland and falling in love with trains. Well, at least he had a fondness for commandeering them to do things that will become very important later on. There's an overview of the railroad that's important, because prior to the railroad, our life was considerably different. And it's hard for us to imagine what life was like without the railroad, because we've always had a railroad around us. But before railroading, if you were going to travel, there was only one way to do it, and that was on a road. You had to walk, you had to ride a horse, you had to go in a stagecoach, you had to have a wagon. Or if you had real money, you could go by boat. But you needed sails, you needed wind, you needed a crew, you needed a tide. In any case, you were tied directly to nature. If you were going to travel, say, from a very easy distance, Baltimore, the port, to a major industrial town west of Baltimore, Ellicott's Mills, it's 10 miles by road. And if you're going to travel that distance, in anywhere 1827 to 1830 by wagon, how long do you think it would take? 3 hours, 4 hours? Double it. 8 hours. Okay? So travel was difficult. There were potholes. There were other people on the road. There were herds of all kinds of animals and what they left in the way. There were tolls to pay. There were arguments. There was all sorts of shenanigans going on the road. But it was the only way west, and west was the hope of the country. The Port of Baltimore was very dependent on all of this traffic. Tobacco products being grown in Howard County had to be taken down Rolling Road. Actually, they were rolled down Rolling Road, put on ships to be taken, on boats to be taken to the harbor. So there was a lot of industry, a lot of commerce and trade, a lot of travel going on. The canal system was competing with the Port of Baltimore, okay, the canals in New York, and they were taking a lot of money out of the port. The citizenry of the city of Baltimore and the industrial economy, the big business people, and the government decided something had to be done. And they were considering a canal. But that canal that was being considered all of a sudden bypassed Baltimore and was going to go from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland. It was going to bypass Baltimore. So Baltimore's economy was dependent on the construction of some new form of transportation, and that would be a railroad. And a railroad was a very different concept. a car pulled by a horse, traveling on rails, could go much faster and carry 12 times the amount of cargo that a wagon could going over the road. So going from Baltimore to Ellicott Mills, instead of taking 8 hours, would take 13 miles an hour. This was just unbelievable. And the most important thing about it is that you had the rails to yourself. You were not sharing it with anybody else. Well, it started and it grew dramatically. The railroad went from 1827, and decisions they would make in constructing the railroad would just accelerate. In 1830, the B&O would begin its real traffic on the road. And by the Civil War, pardon me, in the 1860s, the railroad would have changed the country 100 times more than it had in the first years of its existence. In other words, in 10 years of railroad development, we covered more territory than we did in the first 100 years of the country's existence. The introduction of steam would change the railroad even more. Peter Cooper, interesting guy, he developed a steam engine to replace the horse in the railroad. And I often wonder if it was because he was a glue maker. But his locomotive, the Tom Thumb, would just prove that steam would be a better source of power than a horse. And the first real locomotive to travel on the B&O and be used efficiently was the York. And it would travel at 30 miles an hour. We as a people had never gone that fast. And there were articles in the newspaper that said that if we did dare travel at 30 miles an hour, our appendages would be ripped from our body, our brains would roll out our ears, our eyes would roll out of their sockets. Well, it's changed dramatically, and as you know, that 30 miles an hour is absolutely no big deal. But in the 1830s, 1840s, it was significant. By 1842, the railroad had reached Cumberland, and to go to Harper's Ferry was no big deal. You could go by stagecoach, and it would take you 24 hours and cost $9. You could go by the rails, it would cost $7 and only take 10 hours. So never before had we seen this kind of dramatic development in our economy, and our total dependence on nature had disappeared with the introduction of the steam locomotive. We no longer needed to have wind nor waves. We no longer needed to worry about weather. We could go where we wanted to, when we wanted to. So we're going to take a quantum leap from the 1840s and the railroad running to the beginning of the American Civil War. The first horses, I'm going to drop back as this picture happens to be up. The first railroad cars were pulled by horses. And a fresh horse could only pull a car a certain distance before it had to be changed and replaced with another horse. And of course, as you all know, because you're local historians, that's where this little place got its name. Because the act of changing a horse in the 1800s was called a relay. Okay? This fellow was the station master at Relay at the beginning of the American Civil War. As you know, Maryland had very, very strong leanings towards the Confederacy. And the primary reason was because of the economy. 50% of Baltimore's industry and commerce was being executed with the South. So there was a real need for them to maintain this relationship once the Civil War broke out. April 13th, Fort Sumter was fired on, and with all of that bombardment, there's only one casualty, and that was a Confederate horse. Lincoln, of course, knows we're at war and calls for 75,000 volunteers to go to Washington. Now, these volunteers come to Baltimore by way of another railroad, where they get on the B&O at Camden Station and go south to Washington, D.C., over the Thomas Viaduct. The people of Baltimore aren't too happy about this. The next day, the first troops that went through were Pennsylvania troops. The next day, Massachusetts troops arrived with more Pennsylvania troops on April the 19th. And they're marched through Baltimore because they have to go from one railroad station to another railroad completely to get transported to Washington, D.C. And of course, you all know the Baltimore riot breaks out. The mayor of Baltimore fires into his crowd of his own citizens. He takes a musket from a Union soldier And this is the first real blood of the Civil War. The first people to die or to be wounded happened in Baltimore. And this outrages everybody. So the Army, wanting to move more troops through, has a big challenge because the Confederate sympathizers in Maryland now, after the Baltimore riot, burned the bridges of all the other railroads leading into the city or out of the city. There's only one railroad left standing. It's the B&O. And why? They made a decision in 1827 on how they were going to build their bridges. They had alternative means of construction, and they had alternative materials to build with. But they chose to build with granite. And you can't burn down a granite bridge. You might tear up some track, but that can be replaced very quickly. So the decision in 1827 to build out of granite, to build with Roman arches, to build an empire that would last forever, would affect Maryland and its relationship to the Union in the Civil War. So Winfield Scott says we can't bring troops through Maryland. It's just too dangerous. We're going to incite the community. We don't want to do that. So Benjamin Butler up in Boston has more troops that need to get to Washington. Winfield Scott sends him a message and says, don't take the train. Take a ship. So he does. Puts his troops on ships, comes down the Atlantic coastline, up the Chesapeake Bay into Annapolis. And he goes to take them by train from Annapolis to D.C. The railroad bridges are all burned. He's mad. So he goes and steals himself a locomotive. Takes his men with his locomotive and some cars from the railroad and rebuilds the railroad into Washington, D.C. His people, his bosses in D.C. are very proud of him. And they make him commander-in-chief of the Annapolis sector. Not the exact expression, but he was put in charge of the division of Annapolis. So he's watching Annapolis, and he's moving troops that are coming down by ship to D.C. by train. In the meantime, there's a whole lot of Confederate activity going on in Baltimore and over the B&O Railroad. Men, munitions, supplies, all kinds of things are being sent to the Confederates in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's not West Virginia. It's part of the Confederacy. And a fellow who worked for the B&O Railroad named Ross Winans invented a little weapon called a steam gun. You all know that story. He was trying to get it through to the Confederacy, and it got intercepted in Ellicott City by some Yankees. So Winfield Scott says, you've got to help me protect the railroad, to Butler. So he sends Butler from Annapolis to Relay. And he says, I'm going to put Relay in your department, and we're going to call it the Department of Baltimore. So Butler says, okay. He moves out of Annapolis with 1,700 men and comes to Relay. And he takes the Thomas Viaduct, builds his encampment there with troops from Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York. He settles in, but Baltimore is ready to riot. The governor, Hicks, Thomas Hicks, had moved the state legislature out of Annapolis to Baltimore to prevent them from meeting because he was afraid they would vote to secede from the Union. So the state legislature is going to meet in Baltimore to take this vote. Butler gets wind of it. He commandeers another locomotive. He takes 800 of his 1,700 men that are here in Relay, and he goes towards Ellicott City. He heads west. He gets to Ellicott City, puts the train in reverse, and backs into Baltimore in the middle of a driving thunderstorm. He arrives at Camden Station. You know all that is, right? Where the ballpark is. Takes his men and goes to Federal Hill. He's got 900 men and 6 cannon. Places them on Federal Hill. This is in the middle of the night. The next morning, the city of Baltimore awakes and finds that it's under martial law. He has arrested the entire city council, the entire state legislature, closed the newspapers, at least those that were pro-Confederacy, put in jail 6 out of the 7 federal judges, because this is where the Dred Scott decision was made. He also had issued a proclamation that no display of Confederate sympathy would be tolerated. So if you were wearing any kind of lapel button, or any kind of symbol that said you were pro-Confederate, off to jail you went. He also seized all private arms in the hands of private citizens. Martial law is declared in Baltimore and remained in effect until the end of the war. Now, all of the things I kind of disagree with, except locking up the state legislature, that may have had some merit. In any case, it was by seizing Baltimore that Ben Butler kept Maryland in the Union at gunpoint. Okay? They never had the option to secede. Now, Benjamin Butler was punished for all of this activity. He took a pretty bad public whipping from Lincoln and Winfield Scott and was transferred to Fortress Monroe, Virginia. He was replaced by a fellow named Lew Wallace. Anybody know who Lew Wallace is? Wrote the book, Ben-Hur. He made the proclamation more strict, and his rules were even tougher than Ben Butler's. But Maryland remained in the Union because of Ben Butler and his Department of Baltimore, his orders that he claimed he had been given to keep Maryland from seceding. Now, had Maryland seceded, I don't think the Civil War would have been fought. If Maryland seceded, Washington, D.C. would have been completely surrounded by Confederate states. The Confederacy would have had the Navy. The United States Naval Academy was in Annapolis. If Maryland had seceded, they would have had the Port of Baltimore. If Maryland had seceded, the Confederacy would have had the Patapsco River Valley, which was an industrial complex that rivaled Pittsburgh. So they had this huge manufacturing base, which the Confederacy did not have. And if Maryland had seceded, we probably would not have fought the war in the South. The capital would have been moved to Philadelphia or New York, and if the war were fought at all, perhaps it would have been along the Susquehanna in Pennsylvania and not the Potomac in Virginia. So the decision by the B&O in 1827 to build its bridges out of granite so they would remain standing and used by the Union to keep men and munitions and supplies flowing south. Because if you were going to go anywhere north, south, east, or west at the outbreak of the Civil War, you had to travel over the B&O. And you had to travel over one of those three viaducts. And of course, when they built the Thomas Viaduct, as you all know, they said, this thing isn't going to stand under its own weight. Never mind the weight of a horse and wagon going over it. Never mind a locomotive that's going 30 miles an hour going over it. So, the B&O's foresight, their vision, their philosophy to build an empire that would last forever still impacts us today. That bridge, as you know, is in use every day. If the Patterson were still standing, if it weren't taken out in the flood of 1868, it might still be in use. I am in awe every time I see a locomotive go through Ellicott's Mills and think that that bridge, this viaduct, the Thomas Viaduct, still functions and functions with far superior, far heavier pieces of equipment than we ever imagined with the Tom Thumb or the Yorker sent that time. So I'm in awe and I'm humbled by their foresight, their engineering capabilities, and just things that had never ever been done before. You're going to see an animation. I don't know how many of you have seen it yet on the construction of the viaduct. Have anybody seen it yet? I happen to get a sneak preview of it online, and it is phenomenal. You think about all the things that were going on and have gone on since, that this masterpiece of engineering and construction still serves us today. So, I guess that kind of brings us around to where we want to stop. So we have a couple photographs that I brought that some of you may or may not have seen before of this area, and specifically the Thomas Viaduct. So this is the guy who was the station master at Relay when the Civil War broke out. No one's ever been able to identify him at this point. I know Dan Toomey and Jim Dilts and a bunch of researchers have been trying to find out who he is, but they haven't nailed him down yet. Do you have another one? Yeah. This is the viaduct. And as you can see, there are a couple of folks standing on it. And this is a pretty stock photograph that's been around for a very, very long time. And there's something in each of the photographs of the viaduct that I want to bring up as a sidebar to this whole idea of the railroad and its importance in our development, and what it was a vehicle for besides men and munitions. It's in this photograph. We'll see if anybody sees it.
Telegraph
Go ahead.
lines?
You got it. The World Wide Wire. Communication. We knew within 10 minutes after Fort Sumter had been fired on that the war had started because of the telegraph, which ran along railroad lines. And that was the other reason that Benjamin Butler had to keep the B&O's lines of railroad open, because the telegraph connecting Washington, D.C. and the rest of the United States ran along B&O lines. I call it the World Wide Wire. It's like the World Wide Web. Yeah. Relay with some troops. Everybody says these are some local kids. Now that might be Charles Weygant and Harry Eck. I'm not quite sure. In the relay house, yes, of course, the relay house. All right, these are some of the artillery people that were defending the viaduct and the route west, as well as north and south. I actually have a whole lot more photographs of their camp that I didn't bring. They don't have pictures of the viaduct in it, but there's a lot of camp life that went on in this area, especially when the 12th New Jersey came to town. This is an interesting photograph, and it's the only one I've ever seen that gives us proof that there was a pedestrian bridge over the river at the base of the viaduct. And I don't know, maybe Harry Eck could answer it. We're always trying to keep people off the viaduct railroad because of people getting run over by trains. I wonder if the railroad built it to keep people off the viaduct. Because it was closer to the road, as you can see, but that's an interesting concept. I'm sure that's all wood construction, so 1868, it went in a heartbeat, with the
Do you have any
with the flood.
for that picture?
Yeah, this is 1861. This had to be taken, let's see, when did Ben come up to relay? 21st of April, 1861, he was sent from relay. It was the 21st or the 23rd that Winfield Scott said, get your butt up to relay. Again, some of the troops stationed here. I'm thinking that these are the Massachusetts guys because of their sabers. We had a big discussion about the sabers. What side does the guy wear a saber on and his strap? If he was an infantryman, it would have gone over his left shoulder for his cartridge box. If he's an officer or artillery, or he's cavalry, it goes over his right because you draw your weapons this way. Pistol in your left hand because it's a very inaccurate weapon. It just doesn't do as well as the saber does. So that's why your saber's in your right hand. And classic. Everybody has seen this. Everybody wants to say, well, that's the William Mason. I'm assuming it's a 440, but it's a beautiful photograph of a piece of B&O equipment at relay.
Notice the shelter on the left.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. These are the same guys who are in the other photograph. They just have their sabers back in the scabbards. And the photographers, this was just not to get a picture of the guys. There was, if you'll notice, that every time there's a photograph of the viaduct, there's a human in it to give you a sense of perspective of the size of it and the scope. By the way, can you see this? No.
Notice the iron railing as well.
Yeah.
Not much of it left. Where did you get the pictures, Ed?
I got these from a private collector when I did the first Civil War exhibit at the B&O in Ellicott City. And, crap, I'm drawing a blank on his name. That happens when you get to my age. I'll think of it in a minute. And he gave me these and a whole series of them, and the permission to copy them. And he was an interesting guy. He was mad at some people in Ellicott City, so he gave them to me. He didn't want to give them to the Historic Ellicott City Incorporated or the Historical Society. So I got copies of them, not the originals. Or the artillery. This is up on the hill, so you can see where, how the military approach to defending the viaduct was. They were either going to get him head on if they were coming at him, if like Ross Winans stole a locomotive instead of a stagecoach, or they were going to get him from an artillery barrage from higher elevation.
That's looking north, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And there's one, you can see the cut. There's a magnificent piece of the, again, there's more. That's the guy who's just turned around facing the other direction.
That's it.
Right. There's a whole bunch more that I have that I gave to John that you guys can put in your archives that show the camp and things like that. And I did find one that I have to get printed, and I didn't realize that Rick's camera had gone out of business. I was going to be able to bring it with me tonight. But I have, it's a negative. It's a photograph of the Oliver Viaduct before it lost its arches. You know, that's the one in Ellicott City that takes the railroad over Main Street. There were 3 arches, one for the river, one for eastbound traffic, and one for westbound traffic. And there's this magnificent wagon going under it that's got tons and tons and tons of barrels on it. And all of us in Ellicott City are betting it's beer.
Ed, didn't the B&O, after they built the Carroll Viaduct and then this one here, start running out of money, and then a lot of the others were wood?
Yeah, that was the whole debate in the very beginning. You know, you have to remember that this was never done in this country before, and this was all trial and error. It was just like, as Herb Harwood says, going to the moon back in the 60s. You know, we just, and so granite seemed to be the material of substance that would last forever. Wood was the material of readiness, but it was also very expendable. It was easily broken, it was burned down, or it you know, needed to be replaced sooner than later. Economics drove the change from granite to, and plus development. You know, granite stringers didn't give. You know, a wooden tie expands and contracts and gives with, you know, so again, it was economics and experience that you know, that drove them.
Any
Other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, Ellicott City. Yeah, some of the buildings in town, especially those on the north side of Main Street, are part of the quarry wall. And you know, with the cuts they were making, they were generating their own granite. It was all hand done too. I mean, this is before dynamite.
Yeah, my in-laws used to live in the St. John's Rectory on St. John's Lane, and they always would use the term Howard County granite.
Right.
Because that's what the house was made of, just solid as can be there for 2,000 years.
Yeah, some of the granite from Howard County, Ellicott City, was actually used in the Washington Monument in D.C. as well. That's why it's different colors going up. They ran out of money too and had to stop building with granite. Yes.
How long did it take to build the viaduct?
The Thomas Viaduct, it started in 1830. When did they complete it? 2 years?
33 to 35.
Right. And the method, I can't wait to see this animation. Who did the animation, John? It's phenomenal.
It's an architectural group in Baltimore that we hired to put it together with the help of Jim Dilts. Jim Dilts is a historian, written a beautiful book on the history of the B&O, and has a great interest in architectural structures and in things technical, such as the Thomas Viaduct and trains and so forth. And they went through Latrobe's notes. Latrobe is the designer of the viaduct, and they went through his notes. They didn't have any videotapes of it to work with or anything like that. So it's verbal stuff and in Latrobe's notes. And he worked with the architect thinking, well, what did that mean and how did that work and so forth. So we're going to show that in a short bit.
Was there ever a modern engineering analysis of how much weight could have?
I don't know, Harry, how much do you think it'll hold?
I mean, what's the one there now? I mean, it's quite.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you think the York, that first real locomotive that went over that viaduct, did not weigh as much as one set of wheels of a modern locomotive. Think about that. It's a masterpiece. That's why I marvel. Every time I go down the park, I go, whoa. And when you think, how did they build this thing? You know, we have cranes and we have all sorts of modern massive equipment to build structures like this. These guys didn't. They had men and mules.
The CSX Railroad swears that it's structurally sound and in top-notch structural shape. So they've had their engineers look at it, and I'm sure they've done computations as well.
Yeah.
There were 3 locomotives that were diesels that were parked on the viaduct at one time that I saw.